It seems that in life as a public figure, be that on the internet or elsewhere or everywhere, there are few worse things than to be called a hypocrite. That is to say, people naturally don't like hypocrisy. But the reality is that we are all hypocrites, each and every one of us. All of us run around with all manner of internal and sometimes external self-inflicted contradictions. Now, that's what part of this video is about, and the topic of human hypocrisy is a much larger one, and it warrants an entire video on its own, which is why this video isn't really about that too much. However, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I draw upon the work and make reference to one Robert Kurzban, who is an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania. Much of this work comes from his book, Why Everyone Else, and that's in parentheses, is a Hypocrite, Evolution of the Modular Mind. The idea of the human mind, the brain, rather, as a kind of computer, or as he likes to refer to it, as a kind of smartphone application. This is one that has a lot of currency in cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, etc. That is to say that the mind has various applications, modules, if you will, that perform various tasks. Modules for the selection of food, what food is appropriate, modules for mate selection, modules for discerning cheating and unfairness, modules for understanding mathematics, modules for grasping language, etc. Now, the problem arises because these modules that are proposed to exist, and it seems very, very likely in some way, shape, or form this is how the human brain operates, these modules that exist do not work in concert with each other all the time. And this is the simplest and most plausible explanation we have to date as to why many of the things that we believe in and the things we profess sometimes end up in contradictory stances. For example, the man who is angry at his wife for cheating and then cheats himself, we would deem this hypocrisy, of course, but that's the conflict of the modules. He detects he has his cheating module or application, if you will, and then engages himself, but often remains oblivious to his own cheating, or in some post hoc fashion tries to justify it so as to avoid the contradiction, so as to avoid the image of hypocrisy in his own eyes, in the eyes of his wife, in the eyes of everyone else. So even when we are engaging in contradictory behavior and hypocrisy, oftentimes we try to cover it up, we try to justify it, despite the fact that it stands in direct opposition to what we profess to believe or profess to not believe in some cases. And this isn't just about human choices. It comes down to our optical senses as well. Kurzban provides a very interesting example of parts on a tiled board where things seem to be one way, but it only has to do with the shadows, and we see it a certain way. And this is but a minor example of the many examples in the book. Now, the book itself is reasonably expensive at about $18+ USD. It's a very interesting read. If you're interested, do order it. But this kind of work shows just how much we're at odds with ourselves, with our beliefs, how much they often stand in contradiction to each other. And the other important result of studying the modular mind, or the modular nature of the mind, is to show that, once again, the concept of the discrete self, this I, is fallacious. That if in fact there are many modules and applications operating simultaneously, sometimes in sync and sometimes not, it cannot be that any single one is going to make us, the smart person, as Robert Kurzban likes to describe, the smart ape. It's only the conjunction and the cooperation of many different modules that are often sometimes at odds with each other, nevertheless, that leads to this idea of there is an I, there is a discrete I, there is a discrete self, because very often these modules are operating and working independently of each other. Now, this gives rise, as I said, to the idea of hypocrisy, but that is not the main focus of this video. In fact, as I said, that whole idea of the modular mind and human hypocrisy, that warrants a video in itself, and at some point in time I plan to cover that in depth. But related to this topic is our reflections and our notions and the way we perceive hypocrisy in others. There's the very famous line from the New Testament, something depending on how it's translated from the Koine Greek, do not look to the splinter in his eye, says the mythical Jesus, but look to the log in your own. As is often the case, he's pointing out in this mythical figure that, you see, he is a sinner, but so too are you. And in some sense, I don't believe, obviously, in the mysticism behind the Bible, nor do I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there ever was a Jesus, but that's irrelevant here. What the Jesus figure says, or is quoted as saying in the New Testament, is accurate. We're all hypocrites. We are all sinners of a sort. Now, this is problematic, I think, when it comes to developing the mind and exploring new ideas, and most importantly, changing your mind. Many of you who have been with me for a while, over the years, have noticed that I have evolved. There was a time when Stardust was much more emotional, if you will, and I made more of those sorts of videos than I do now. In fact, I'm completely disinclined to make any of those kinds of videos these days. And this is because people change, views change, personalities change, when perhaps the core personality doesn't, or if not completely changing, certain aspects of the personality are more strongly reinforced than others. In my quest to understand the world, to understand who I am, who we are as human beings, as Homo sapiens, things have taken their natural course, and I am not inclined towards emotionality, or I don't really respond very well to the emotional. It's just one example. Additionally, it's almost impossible not to be a conventional hypocrite if you are researching, studying, acquiring new knowledge, and at some point in time, the things that you've acquired, the facts, the information, flip a switch in your mind that leads you to a different conclusion that you might have previously held, right? If you are searching for knowledge and trying to understand things, a change of mind is almost inevitable. After all, what is the point to sticking to, just for the sake of a consistency, some old, long-held view just to be consistent, just to please people, just to please the masses? There was a time, many winters ago, I was 17 or maybe 18, when I was a dyed-in-the-wool Ayn Randian, objectivist. I think those beliefs rather foolish, at least some of them, these days, but at the time, I was utterly convinced. I received new information over time. I learned more about the world, and increasingly the things that Ayn Rand had talked about became less and less relevant to my life, etc. People change their minds. There was a time, many winters ago, when our friend Barbarossa was what seems to be a reasonably devout Christian, and these views on Christianity and the notion of religion have changed in his eyes as well. Should he suffer a penalty for that? Quite the opposite. While I don't necessarily believe in praise and laudation, I do believe in at least acknowledging that changing one's mind is actually a good thing. It shows an openness and a willingness to accept new information as time goes by and as things themselves change. Why cling to a long-held belief simply to cling to that long-held belief? Whatever that belief might be, times are a-changing. Winter is coming, as they say in Game of Thrones. Well, change is coming. If I'm to run this channel for a long time, which is my plan if fortune favors me, the gods favor me, I can only do so by continuing along the path of change. The progression of knowledge, the more things I learn, the more I realize I know very little. But this in turn triggers a desire to learn more, and this will affect my ability to perceive the world and what I think of the world and what I think of human beings. What if, hypothetically, I were to experience or acquire some radical piece of information that held a lot of water, that seemed to have a great deal of evidence behind it? What then? And that somehow affects my views, or it stands in contrast to my previous views. Necessarily, I would have to change my views. You see, for me to remain content, I do not want to be wrong for a second longer than I have to be. And of course, in every conventional sense, even though we're all hypocrites, that makes me a hypocrite. After all, changing your mind is one of the worst sins you can commit as a public figure. Whether I'm a public figure or not is up for debate, but as some sort of internet personality nonetheless, I guess I am. And it's so funny that people afoot and people abroad and people everywhere hold public figures and people in general to such high standards that they never change their beliefs, that they never, ever waver from what they've believed once. How is that even possible? Unless you begin to lie to yourself and lie to others. So what I'm suggesting is we're all inconsistent, but the greatest inconsistency is to continue to perpetuate and profess a belief that you no longer hold for the sake of pleasing the masses, pleasing your subscribers, pleasing your viewers, pleasing your voters, whatever. That is a far greater inconsistency than acquiring a new piece of information that might or might not change your mind on a particular issue and adjusting your position on that issue accordingly. The worst of hypocrisy is the preacher, for example, who no longer believes in the Word of God, professing the Word of God, because why? His livelihood depends on it. He's afraid to be called a hypocrite. He's afraid to be called X, Y, Z, whatever. Rather than having the grace to admit that his previous view in all likelihood was incorrect, and he wants to amend that and move on and go to a different place. You see, that is the nature of being a human being, and we can repress that change. We can suppress knowledge. We can resist the desire to mold our minds into something new and mold our worldview into something new, or we can't. We can move forward by acknowledging that, yes, we're all hypocrites. We all have internal contradictions. But some of us are attempting to tease out the complexity of the world as best we can, and inevitably you run into obstacles on that path, and inevitably you're going to change your mind on that path. So I propose to you that those who cling to beliefs they no longer hold, or resist new information in order to protect their long-held beliefs, are far worse hypocrites than those who acknowledge that they are changing their mind because of new information and acknowledge that the winds of change abound, that they're everywhere, and that they themselves are affected by them. Now, I don't really want to plod on too much longer. That's pretty much all I had to say. As I said, the concept of the modular mind, internal contradictions, and hypocrisy is noteworthy and worthy of a video in of itself, in all likelihood a scripted video. Something I plan on doing one day if I'm still alive, who knows. But as always, thanks for watching, and everyone take care and enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye.